What if I told you that the world's first central bank wasn't built of marble, gold, or even coins, but grain? Long before the Federal Reserve, before the Bank of England, before the concept of money as we know it, ancient Egypt built a financial system so advanced that it could collect taxes, stabilize prices, issue credit, and even bail out its own economy, all 4,000 years before Wall Street ever existed. But here's the mystery. How did a civilization with no coins, no digital ledgers, and no modern bureaucracy create a functioning monetary system? And how did that same system, once the backbone of the empire, eventually collapse under its own weight? Today, we're uncovering the hidden story of the Egyptian grain economy, a system that may have been the first central bank in human history. Part 1. Setting the stage: Gold, Sand, and Surplus. Egypt wasn't just the land of pharaohs and pyramids, it was a machine built for agriculture. Each year, the Nile's floods deposited rich silt along its banks, turning barren land into one of the most fertile zones on Earth. And this predictable cycle, flood, plant, harvest, made one thing possible: surplus. When you have more grain than you can eat, something revolutionary happens. You can store it. And when you can store it, you can trade it. And when you can trade it, you can build an economy. But here's the twist. Egypt didn't just store grain in barns, they built a national network of grain banks, massive state-run silos connected by a centralized bureaucracy. To understand how radical that was, imagine a system where the government controlled both production and savings, where your bank account was measured not in dollars, but in sacks of wheat. And this all started thousands of years before the word bank was even invented. Part 2. The birth of the grain economy. Around 2500 BCE, during Egypt's Old Kingdom, the state realized something critical. Control the grain, and you control everything. Grain wasn't just food, it was taxes, salary, and savings. Farmers paid their dues in grain, workers were paid in grain, temples accumulated grain as wealth. And because grain could be stored, measured, and redistributed, it became a perfect currency substitute. But to manage all this, Egypt needed infrastructure, and that's where the granaries of Pharaoh came in. Visual, cut to reconstructions of massive mud brick granaries. These weren't small silos. Some granaries held tens of thousands of tons of wheat and barley, all meticulously recorded by a new kind of elite, the scribes. Scribes were the ancient world's accountants. With papyrus scrolls and reed pens, they tracked inflows and outflows, ensuring that the kingdom's wealth, its grain, never went missing. And here's the genius. When a farmer deposited grain into the state granary, he received a receipt, a written note proving his deposit. That receipt could then be traded. In other words, Egypt had invented paper money 4,000 years early. Part 3. The rise of Pharaoh's treasury, centralization and power. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, this system had matured. All grain storage and taxation was centralized under the royal treasury, based in Memphis and later Thebes. From here, the pharaoh, advised by the vizier, effectively the ancient minister of finance, oversaw the inflow and outflow of the kingdom's food supply. When harvests were strong, grain was stored. When floods failed, grain was released, stabilizing prices and preventing famine. Sound familiar? That's exactly what modern central banks do with interest rates and liquidity. The pharaoh's treasury, in effect, functioned as the Federal Reserve of the ancient world, controlling supply, regulating markets, and ensuring political stability through economic control. But the brilliance went deeper. By setting grain prices and controlling its distribution, the Egyptian state could effectively manage inflation and support trade across its empire. Temples, too, played a critical role. They acted like regional banks, storing local grain reserves and lending them out with interest. Yes, interest. Records from temple archives show that loans of grain were repaid with a 20% surplus, often measured in additional wheat. This wasn't charity, It was finance. And in a society where the pharaoh was both king and god, finance was divine order. Part 4: Cracks in the system: drought, debt, and dependency. But no system lasts forever. Around 2200 BCE, Egypt suffered one of the worst climate events in its history. The Nile failed to flood for several consecutive years. Without floods, no crops. Without crops, no grain. And without grain, the entire economy collapsed. The state's reserves, once overflowing, were emptied to feed the population. The temples, once lenders, became desperate borrowers. And the receipts that once symbolized wealth, they became worthless. When the storage is empty, a receipt for grain is just a piece of paper. Egypt's economy had built itself on trust in central storage, but when that trust broke, the entire structure imploded. Archaeological evidence from this period, known as the First Intermediate Period, shows famine, rebellion, and social breakdown. In essence, Egypt experienced the first recorded financial collapse, triggered not by greed or speculation, but by over-centralization. The pharaoh's grain economy, once the empire's strength, became its Achilles heel. Part 5: Rebirth and Reform: The New Kingdom and Economic Renaissance. Eventually, the floods returned. A new dynasty rose, and with it, a lesson learned. The Middle and New Kingdoms restructured Egypt's economy, spreading control between the royal treasury and temple networks. They refined the use of grain tokens, improved record keeping, and diversified trade, incorporating gold, silver, and copper as secondary media of exchange. Grain remained the foundation, but now it was supported by metals and trade credits from regions like Nubia and the Levant. And once again, Egypt thrived. But lurking beneath the prosperity was a familiar problem: bureaucratic corruption and inefficiency. As centuries passed, officials began exploiting the grain system for personal gain. Fake records, false shortages, and bribes became common. By the late period, Egypt's economy was so rigid and overregulated that local markets began to reject the state system altogether. Private traders emerged, independent middlemen who used metal weights instead of grain accounts. And with them, the old system of grain as currency began to crumble. Part 6: The Breaking Point: The Greek and Roman Takeover. By the time of Alexander the Great, and later the Roman conquest, Egypt's grain economy was both its greatest strength and its weakness. To the Greeks, Egypt was a miracle, a land that could feed the world. To the Romans, it was the empire's breadbasket. They didn't dismantle the grain system, they appropriated it. The Roman state granaries in Alexandria became the logistical heart of imperial grain supply, shipping thousands of tons of Egyptian wheat to Rome every year. But under Roman rule, Egypt's economy was no longer independent. Its centralized grain system, once designed to protect the people, now served the empire's hunger. And in that irony lies the ultimate tragedy. What began as the world's first financial innovation became the engine of its own exploitation. Part 8: Modern Parallels: The Echoes of Ancient Finance. If all of this sounds familiar, it should, because in many ways, our modern economy is a reflection of ancient Egypt's. Central banks still control supply and trust, just like the pharaoh's treasury. Currencies are still backed by confidence, not physical goods. And economic crises, from inflation to shortages, still hinge on the same principle. When trust in the system breaks, the receipts become worthless. Let's look at a few chilling parallels. In 2008, mortgage-backed securities were the modern grain receipts, promises built on assets that suddenly lost value. During the 2020 supply shocks, food and energy systems revealed how fragile centralized logistics can be, echoing Egypt's Nile failures. And today, digital banking and central bank digital currencies are once again centralizing economic power, promising stability, but at the cost of systemic risk. History, it seems, never repeats, but it rhymes. Part 8: Lessons from the First Central Bank. So, what can we learn from the world's first experiment in centralized finance? Here are 3 clear takeaways. 1. Control is not the same as stability. Egypt's pharaohs believed that by controlling all grain, they could prevent chaos.
But too much control meant that when disaster struck, the entire system failed at once. Decentralization isn't inefficiency, it's resilience. 2. Money is trust, nothing more, nothing less. Whether it's grain receipts, coins, or digital credits, all currency relies on belief in redemption. When people lose faith that their note can be exchanged for value, money dies, regardless of the material it's printed on. 3. Every economy has a breaking point. Even the most advanced systems collapse when they forget the human factor, the farmer, the scribe, the citizen. When wealth becomes too abstract, economies lose connection to their roots. Part 9. The Warning and the Call to Action. The Egyptian grain economy wasn't just an ancient curiosity, it was the prototype of everything that came after. It showed humanity that you could